My mom hijacked my wedding with a speech claiming falsely that I had ruined her life, so I exposed her dark truth and left her to face shame forever. My relationship with my mother has always been strained, a fragile thread that never quite wove us together. When my parents divorced when I was 11, they agreed on shared custody, splitting my time between them every other month. In reality, I spent far less time with her, maybe 3 or 4 months a year at most, because she was perpetually too busy to care for me. As a real estate agent, her job wasn't particularly demanding, certainly not enough to justify her absence, which left me wondering if she simply didn't want me around. Her excuses felt flimsy, and the distance between us grew. Even before the divorce, we lacked the closeness I craved. While I longed for the bond little girls often share with their mothers, she seemed content with her own circle of friends, leaving little room for me. I needed her warmth, her presence, but she never seemed to grasp that. Over time, our connection frayed further. Her visits to my father's house, where I primarily lived, were sporadic, and my stays at her place felt like obligations rather than homecomings. By 13, I began to see clearly, my mother and I were emotionally worlds apart. Her house never felt like mine, even she felt like a stranger. Things grew more complicated in my late teens when she started dating. Her boyfriend's presence made everything awkward, and I sensed a strange undercurrent of jealousy from her. She'd belittle me, tossing out cutting remarks or mocking me in front of them, as if I were a rival vying for their attention. It was baffling and hurtful. What kind of mother diminishes her own daughter to impress a fleeting partner? Once, I called her out, confronting the sting of her words. She brushed it off as just joking, accusing me of overreacting and playing the victim. Frustrated, I decided to mirror her behavior. When she took jabs at me, I fired back with my own sharp retorts. Our exchanges turned into petty verbal sparring matches, each of us trying to outdo the other in cruelty. It was strangely satisfying, almost like a game, though it drove her dates away, their discomfort palpable. Eventually, she toned down her remarks, and I, in turn, visited her less often, retreating to the comfort of my father's home, where I felt I truly belonged. My dad was the one who would push me to have a relationship with her, and honestly, had it not been for him, I probably never would have even bothered to speak to the woman. There was also the time period from when I was 18 until I graduated college when my father was going through a rough patch financially because his business wasn't doing very well. I had to pay for tuition somehow, and even though I hated the very idea of it, I ended up asking my mother if she could help us out. She said that she was really sorry and that she wished she could help, but unfortunately, she didn't have enough money because she was also getting engaged and was saving to get married and go on her honeymoon in a couple of months. At the time, I wouldn't have cared about that because, obviously, she doesn't owe me her money. But when I saw her wedding, it was ridiculously extravagant and fancy, which made me feel a bit annoyed because I felt like she really could have helped me out with the tuition, and she chose not to out of spite. She could afford to help, but she chose not to, and that rubbed me the wrong way. And it was very funny because that wedding was probably more expensive than whatever I was going to ask her to contribute to my tuition. My father was ready to bear most of the cost, we just needed a little help from her. And that marriage didn't even last more than 2 years, so what was all the fuss even about? Even then, my father told me to let it go, and I did because it wasn't worth it, and I didn't want to come off as an entitled brat. Now, I'm almost 28, and I finally had my own wedding a couple of days ago. I invited my mother at the insistence of my dad, who thought that it would be necessary to have my family with me on such an important day. I wanted to say no to that, but I always have a hard time saying no to my father, so I did invite my mother, and she said that she was ready to attend. I told her that she needed to get her outfit approved by me because I knew that if I left it up to her, she would show up wearing something outrageously inappropriate. She sounded a little disappointed when I told her that, and I feel like she had every intention to upstage me, but it all went to hell when I said that she would have to get her outfit approved. She even asked me if I was doing this for everybody who was attending, and I said that, yes, I was, even though it wasn't true because I didn't want to give her any opportunities to cause any drama. She did send me a couple of outfits, and I approved the least crazy one. I also told her that I would prefer it if she didn't make a speech or anything, and she seemed quite affronted by that, but I managed to save the situation by telling her that the only reason I was avoiding speeches was because my dad wasn't giving a speech either, and I didn't want the ceremony to go over time or anything because people were bringing their kids as well, so we wanted to keep everything as short and sweet as possible. Again, that wasn't true, but by the time she found out, it would be too late for her to do anything about it. I thought I was out of danger, and even though my mother was attending the wedding, I wouldn't give her any opportunity to mess anything up. But, true to character, she did her very best and, unfortunately, succeeded in annoying me on the day of my wedding, in spite of my best efforts. I really do regret inviting her. So, on the day of my wedding, after the vows were exchanged, It was time for the speeches, and as soon as my mother saw my father getting up to his feet and grabbing the mic, she shot me the dirtiest look she could manage. My father's speech was beautiful and emotional, so it put my mother's look out of my mind altogether. But then, to my horror, I saw her rising from her seat and taking the mic from my father. I wanted to do something, but I didn't want to create a scene at my own wedding by snatching the mic away from her. My husband tried to redirect everyone to the dance floor, but my mother said that she needed everyone to remain seated so we could enjoy the little speech that she'd spent days writing for me. I was terrified when she started talking, and sure enough, this speech was all about herself and how I had absolutely ruined her life by just being born. She went on and on about how many sacrifices she had to make as a mother and how I didn't seem to be grateful for any of them. She even threw in some tears to make it seem like she was hurt and brought up how I'd lied to her so she wouldn't make a speech at my wedding. She told everyone that she'd given up a really big promotion when she was pregnant with me because she didn't want to stress herself out before the delivery and feared that something would happen if she did take that up. Apparently, she was still paying the price of rejecting that promotion because she was still working in a similar position for similar pay. I knew that it wasn't true because my mother was pretty well off. I had no idea what she was complaining about, but she went on talking about how I'd been a pain to raise all along. She expected me to be grateful for it and reminded me of how many boyfriends she had given up on when I was in my teens because they didn't appreciate me being around, and she couldn't sacrifice her motherhood. But clearly, I was willing to push her to the sidelines and pretend like she wasn't an important part of my life for heaven's sake knows what reason. She ended the speech by telling everybody how selfless and great she'd been as a mother, but obviously, she'd failed if her own daughter didn't deem her worthy of even telling her the truth. It was a dramatic and mostly embellished story that she was trying to tell with that speech of hers. I put up with a lot of things about my mother over the last couple of years of my life, but this was way too much for me to tolerate. So, I stood up and decided to reveal what kind of person she really was to everyone present there. Everything that I talked about in the first couple of paragraphs in this post is what I mentioned in my speech, essentially because it was the truth, and I felt like I needed to set the record straight and also because I wasn't going to let my mother get away with lying about me and playing the victim after ruining my wedding. I revealed the truth about how she used to treat me as a child and how she used to compete with me when I was in my teens, which is a pretty sick thing coming from one's own mother. My father's jaw dropped open when I came out with these stories from my childhood because he'd always insisted that we keep these things private. The world doesn't need to know everything that goes on in our family, he used to say. It was because we didn't need to wash dirty linen in public, but honestly, I think it was because he cared way too much about appearances than about putting the truth out there. I could see everybody getting uncomfortable while I was ranting about my mother, and my mother just looked at the floor and occasionally glared at me, trying to scare me into shutting up. But, unfortunately, the guests weren't her dates, and I wasn't a teen anymore, so her intimidation tactics were becoming a little ineffective. After I was done talking, I was pretty much in tears, and my husband took me aside. He opened up the bar and made sure that food would be served soon after so the guests would have something to do rather than sit and gossip about me and the meltdown that I just had. He told my parents to stay away for a while and took me outside of the venue to our hotel room so I could calm down. I was sobbing because I was crying so hard, and it took me several minutes to compose myself. He talked me through it and comforted me throughout. After a while, I finally felt better and said that I was ready to go back because there was no way I was missing my own wedding over something that my mother did. I'd always known that she was jealous of me, and this was just that jealousy manifesting in its worst form, nothing else. My husband told me to wait in the room for a while so he could go and check if my mother was gone and even asked me if I wanted my father to stick around or not. I said yes because, in spite of everything, he was still my father, and I just didn't want to let him go. He came back up after about 10 minutes and told me that I could come back to the party because my mother was gone. Apparently, she left right after I walked out because she didn't come here to be insulted by her own daughter, and my father actually yelled at her and kicked her out after she said that. I was actually pretty pleased to hear that. As soon as I was back, my father apologized to me for everything, and we hugged, which felt great. We resumed the event, and a lot of my guests came up to me and told me that I was really brave for calling out my mother on her rubbish in front of that many people and on the day of my wedding, no less. My mother-in-law was also pretty impressed and said that she was glad her son was marrying such a strong and intelligent woman. That made me feel a lot better, and by the end of the day, I'd pretty much forgotten about that little hitch. Once I got back home from my hotel room, I finally had enough time to check my phone, and there I noticed that there was a message from my mother that I hadn't read. I clicked on her chat out of curiosity and realized that she'd written a real speech and sent me a picture of that. I went through the speech that she'd written, and it was actually pretty sweet. I noticed that she'd sent me that picture a couple of hours after she left, along with a message that said that this was the speech that she had written ages ago, Pretty much on the day that I sent her the invitation after I told her that nobody was doing speeches at my wedding. She'd almost discarded this, but then she thought she would give it to me on the day of my wedding so I could have it as an early wedding gift. Her actual wedding gift was supposed to be a car that I was meant to receive a week after my wedding, and it was supposed to be a surprise for me. But after my mother saw my father give a speech and even my in-laws take turns, she realized that I'd lied to her and was so hurt by that she said the things that she did. She told me that she was quite aware of our troubled history together, but she wanted to make things right when she received the invitation, and the speech that she had actually written was supposed to be her apology. But she never got a chance to make that speech because of my lies. She told me that she wished me nothing but happiness on this new journey that I was embarking upon, but she never wanted to meet me or hear from me ever again because I had broken her heart and insulted her all over some petty feud from ages ago. After I read that message, I realized that I kind of screwed up by just assuming that my mother would do something to ruin my special day. She said that now, because of what happened, nobody wanted to talk to her, and she was really upset that I just assumed she would try and somehow ruin my wedding. After reading her messages, I was disappointed and have been for the past couple of days. I haven't yet told anyone about this because I don't want anyone to think that I'm the one at fault here. I don't even know if I really am or not. So, am I the asshole for assuming that my mom would do something to ruin my wedding and lying to her to prevent it? It helped me think about everything regarding my mother in a new light. Maybe lying to her hadn't been the best idea, but I had to do it, given our previous tiffs. And I think it's pretty convenient that she just shifted the entire blame onto me because I feel like if she wanted to make a speech that badly and apologize to me for everything, then she could have done so even after she found out that I'd lied to her about my no speeches policy. I don't even understand where there was the need to make such a public apology. It wasn't as if everybody in our family was aware that we didn't share a good relationship. Only a couple of people close to me knew about it, so there really wasn't any need for her to apologize at my wedding. Besides, it wasn't even the place or occasion for that. It was a day meant to celebrate me and my husband and not bring up things from the past so she could make it all about herself yet again, but just in a different and more socially acceptable way. I told my dad and husband about it and asked their opinion on whatever she told me, and they brought up an interesting perspective as well. I showed them the picture of the letter that she sent me, and they pointed out that the letter didn't look old at all and actually looked pretty recently written. My mother claimed that she'd written out the speech months ago, around the time I sent her the invitation, but if we were to go by that, then the letter should have at least looked a little folded or something, just something to indicate that it had been a while since she'd written it. But there was nothing as such, so it was quite possible that she wrote the letter the very same day after she was kicked out of the wedding and sent it to me to guilt trip me. I would hate to believe that their theory was somehow true, but I don't know. Going by my mother's behavior in the past, I can't exactly rule it out. The bottom line is, I'm not going to talk to her, and I'm definitely not going to feel guilty about it. So, it's been close to 8 days since my wedding. My mother hadn't contacted me so far, and I thought that she was over the whole thing, but yesterday, she showed up at my house. Since it was the weekend, both my husband and I were at home, and she mentioned that it was good because she wanted both of us to know this, and she also wanted my father to hear about what she was just going to tell us. I was really confused and almost didn't even let her enter, but she pushed her way through and sat herself on the couch. Then she announced that she decided to leave all her money to charity instead of to me, like she'd planned initially. She looked at my husband and then told him that because of my awful behavior, he could now say goodbye to all the money that we were about to inherit. She told me to tell my father about this as well because he'd been the one to kick her out on the day of my wedding. She really took that insult to heart and told us that we were not going to inherit anything from her. The air was thick with tension as I stood on my porch, facing my mother after months of silence. Her unexpected arrival, brimming with an unwarranted sense of entitlement to meet my newborn son, had already set my nerves on edge. But when she began her announcement, attempting to sweep away the pain of the past as if it were dust under a rug, I felt a surge of resolve. I couldn't let her rewrite our history. I brought up the speech she had given at my wedding years ago, a moment that had seared itself into my memory. In that speech, she had painted me as the source of her career's stagnation, claiming that my birth had forced her to reject a promotion and tethered her to a mediocre job. She had spun a narrative where I, an infant at the time, was somehow responsible for her unfulfilled ambitions. The weight of those words had lingered, a quiet wound I'd carried for years. Her face flushed with surprise as I called her out. She likely hadn't expected me to confront her lies so directly, especially not in the wake of her audacious attempt to re-enter my life. Stammering slightly, she doubled down, insisting that if I hadn't been born, she might have climbed higher in her career, perhaps even landed a prestigious role at a top-tier company. Her words were sharp, but they lacked the conviction of truth. I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, incredulous sound that echoed my disbelief. I told her that if she had truly aspired to reach the top, she would have found a way, just as countless others do despite life's challenges. Blaming a child for her own shortcomings was not only unfair but absurd. I reminded her that it wasn't her who had shouldered the primary responsibility of raising me. My father had been the one juggling late-night feedings, school runs, and his burgeoning business, all while maintaining his drive to succeed. If he could balance fatherhood and ambition, what was her excuse? She opened her mouth to argue, her eyes flashing with indignation, but I cut her off. My voice was steady, though my heart raced with years of pent-up frustration. I told her that her threats to disinherit me were meaningless. Newton, my husband, and I had built our own lives, financially secure and independent of her. Her inheritance, whatever it amounted to, wasn't some grand fortune that would sway us. It didn't matter to us, and her attempts to wield it as leverage only deepened the chasm between us. I asked her to leave, my tone polite but firm, hoping she'd respect my boundaries. But she stood her ground, her face hardening as she demanded an apology from me. The audacity of it, her expecting me to grovel after everything she'd done, ignited a spark of anger in me. I warned her that if she didn't leave, I would call the police to have her removed from my property. She scoffed, insisting I was bluffing, that I wouldn't dare take such a step against my own mother. But when she saw my fingers dialing the numbers on my phone, her bravado faltered. With a final, venomous curse, she stormed off, leaving the air heavy with the weight of our fractured bond. That weekend was a whirlwind of emotions, but confronting my mother felt like a release, a moment where I could finally speak my truth without fear of judgment. Newton stood by my side, his unwavering support a pillar of strength. Even my father, who had often remained silent during family conflicts, called later to praise how I'd handled the situation. His words, though simple, meant the world to me. They reminded me of the family I'd chosen, Newton, our newborn son, and the relatives who had rallied around us during the fallout with my sister, Elle. I felt a profound gratitude for their presence, a reminder that I wasn't alone in navigating this painful chapter. In the week that followed, my mother's attempts to reconnect were relentless. She texted me repeatedly, oscillating between pleas for reconciliation and subtle manipulations. She listed every act of kindness she'd shown me as a child, as if those moments could erase the years of neglect, blame, and now, her defense of Elle's violent actions. For every good deed she highlighted, I could recall countless instances of her absence, her criticism, or her tendency to prioritize her own narrative over my well-being. The balance was far from even, and her messages felt like a calculated attempt to guilt me into submission. I tried to ignore her, muting her notifications to preserve my peace, but she escalated by texting from another number. It was as if she couldn't fathom that I might need space, that I might choose myself over her. Finally, I blocked her. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Despite our strained relationship, I had kept her number unblocked because she lives alone, and I wanted to be reachable if something happened to her. But her persistence crossed a line, and I realized that maintaining that open door was no longer my responsibility. If, heaven forbid, something were to happen, I could rely on her neighbor's contact information to stay informed without subjecting myself to her toxicity. I couldn't keep prioritizing family ties at the expense of my own mental health. It wasn't fair to me, and I was done sacrificing my well-being for the sake of appeasing her. Days later, I learned from a cousin that my mother was planning to move out of state. She had taken to social media, crafting a dramatic post that named both my father and me, lamenting that her family had abandoned her. She claimed there was nothing left for her here, painting herself as a victim of our rejection. The post was steeped in emotion, designed to elicit sympathy and perhaps guilt. But I felt nothing but a quiet resolve. I didn't respond or reach out. Her words, though heavy with accusation, held no power over me anymore. Just as she had written that there was nothing left for her here, I felt the same about our relationship. There was nothing left for me to salvage. Her attempt to pull us back together was too late, coming after years of blame and months of defending Elle's unforgivable actions. I wished her well in her new chapter, but I knew with certainty that I wanted no part in it. As harsh as it sounds, it was the truth. I hoped never to see her again. Reflecting on these events, I found myself grappling with the complexity of family. Growing up, I had idolized the idea of a close-knit family, one that celebrated every milestone together, as we had done for years. But the betrayal by Elle, followed by my parents' refusal to hold her accountable, shattered that illusion. My mother's accusations at my wedding, her insistence that my existence had derailed her life, were not new wounds but part of a pattern. She had always found ways to shift blame, to make me feel responsible for her unfulfilled dreams. Yet, as I stood up to her on my porch, I realized how much I had grown. I was no longer the child seeking her approval, nor the young woman hurt by her words at my wedding. I was a mother now, with a family of my own to protect, and that gave me the strength to draw a line. Newton's support was a constant through it all. His fierce protectiveness, especially when it came to our son, reminded me of the kind of parent I wanted to be, one who prioritizes love and accountability over blind loyalty. My father's unexpected praise was another anchor, a reminder that not all family ties were tainted. He had been the one to raise me, to show me what it meant to balance responsibility and ambition. His success in his career, despite the demands of fatherhood, stood in stark contrast to my mother's excuses. It made her claims feel all the more hollow. As I move forward, I'm focused on creating a safe, nurturing environment for my son. The decision to install cameras around our home was born out of necessity, a precaution against further intrusions by my mother or Elle. The restraining order against Elle remains in place, and I'm considering one for my parents as well. The thought of cutting ties so definitively is painful, but it's also liberating. I've spent too long trying to preserve relationships that only brought hurt. Now, my priority is my son, Newton, and the family we're building together. The wounds of the past will take time to heal, but each step I take, whether confronting my mother, blocking her number, or choosing not to engage with her social media ploys, feels like a step toward reclaiming my peace. I don't know what the future holds for my mother or Elle. I hope they find healing, just as I'm seeking mine. But I've learned that healing doesn't mean reconciliation. Sometimes, it means walking away, choosing yourself, and building a life free from the shadows of those who can't love you the way you deserve. For me, that's enough.